instead of trying to come up with the right answer, try to come up with 10 answers. Crazy answers, ordinary answers, brilliant answers, stupid answers, doesn't matter, illegal answers. Shift the goal from quality to quantity. And as you practice that muscle, you find yourself in that reflex more naturally. In the meeting, when somebody's coming up with ideas, you're less precious. Somebody asks a question, you're more willing to throw something out there because you've learned something critical, which is the following. There's no cost to saying a bad idea. None. And yet we don't do it because we're afraid. We're afraid of what people are going to say or ourselves, what we're going to think. And so we don't grow the muscle. We don't grow the ability. But it doesn't have to be that way.
Hello and welcome. Before I introduce the next guest of the show, I want to thank you for listening and recommending the show to your network. There are more than 5 million podcast shows worldwide, and the 1% Project in 2022 was among the top 15% most followed shows as per Spotify. 2023 will be bigger and better with another set of amazing guests who will share their insights on career and life. My first guest on the 1% Project this year is the exuberant Jeremy Utley. Jeremy is the Director of Executive Education at Stanford's D.school and an adjunct professor at Stanford School of Engineering. He is a celebrated keynote speaker and the co-author of the brilliant book, Ideaflow, The Only Business Metric That Matters, a book which has been put on the recommendation list of JP Morgan, McKinsey, BCG, and multiple other organizations and publications. Today, Jeremy works to assist individuals in transforming their established self-perception and learn, like him, that it is possible to contribute creatively to the world without being exceptional. His book, Ideaflow, is a product of his journey in helping people develop the skill of generating new problem-solving ideas. Jeremy believes one can cultivate the habit of generating ideas with practice and techniques he explores in his book, much like any other habit. The conversation yielded great insights on practicing the meta skill of idea generation, the concepts of idea ratio, idea quota, and innovation sandwich to facilitate business innovation in organizations, attracting and retaining innovative people, finding better problems to solve, and much more. If you have any feedback about this conversation, speaker, or topic recommendation, you can drop me a line at pritish@1%.live. Subscribe to the show wherever you're listening to it, and sign up to the 1% Project's Think newsletter at 1%.live, where we bring highly curated content from the internet that adds value to your professional and personal development. We kick this conversation off with Jeremy asking him, when it comes to creativity, why is quantity more important than quality?
The thing that most people don't realize actually is that the quality of your ideas is a function of the quantity of your ideas. And so it's not that quantity is more important than quality so much as quantity actually leads to quality. And so if you want to get quality, focus on quantity. And so it's not that it's more important, but it's the way to get there. I go all over the world teaching. From Stanford, I'll go to Tokyo or Tel Aviv or Topeka, Kansas, anywhere in the world. And when I tell people, I'm going to help you come up with ideas, I always get the same response. You know what people say, no matter where they are in the world? They say, how do I come up with a good idea? I say, that's not what I said. I said, I'm going to help you come up with ideas. Who said anything about good? But people can't even let themselves think of ideas without thinking good ideas. And that's a very limiting factor to realize that when we think about ideas or about coming up with ideas, we really only think about good. And that's incredibly limiting in terms of the variability of our thinking. And variability and volume are actually two of the key drivers in producing great outcomes. The challenge is they produce lots of bad outcomes too. And most people just want good. And so they try to get rid of the bad. And by getting rid of the bad, they actually undermine their ability to generate good.
So a follow-up would be, why shouldn't you be judging yourself while coming up with ideas?
Well, I mean, it gets back to this idea of filtering, right? And self-censorship is a real enemy to creativity. So Charles Lim's a researcher at MIT who did a fMRI scan of jazz musicians and freestyle hip hop artists. And what he discovered is when a jazz musician went into their really creative improvisational state, what happened to the blood flow in the brain was the part of the brain that's responsible for judgment actually got shut off. And what enables jazz musicians to improvise is their ability to not judge simultaneous to the moments or act of creation. And so it turns out we just don't do both well. We aren't good multitaskers. If we're trying to simultaneously generate and evaluate, we do both poorly. And the outcomes have been demonstrated time and again to be much better if you generate without evaluation and then separately if you evaluate.
In your book, you say that every problem is an ideas problem. Can you double click on that?
Yeah, absolutely. Fundamentally, what we mean there is problems only yield to one thing, which is solutions. And a problem is only a problem if you don't know how to solve it. So if you have a task or something that needs to get done and you know how to solve it, that's not a problem. It's just a task. You just got to get it done. A problem is that for which you don't have a good answer or the right answer. And so when we say every problem is an ideas problem, what we mean is when you realize a problem is something for which you don't have a good answer, then you can say, well, what do I do when I don't have an answer? And the answer is I need lots of ideas. That's what we mean by every problem is an ideas problem, because fundamentally the way to discover the answer is to generate lots of ideas.
Based on that, let's get into the book. Tell us, what is the hypothesis behind it, how it came through, and what does it solve for?
The basic idea with Ideaflow is you need a volume of ideas and you need to be having them, generating them, testing them routinely, almost like picture a river flowing, that where there's a constant stream of new ideas, new experiments, etc. And the reason it's so important is because there's always new problems to solve. It's not as if we exist in a static world where there's no change and no disruption. Change is continuous, disruption is continuous, new problems are continuous. And therefore, you need a continuous practice of generating novel solutions and testing novel solutions to find their fittedness with the problems that haven't emerged yet. And so idea flow, the notion there is how many ideas are you coming up with over a period of time? How many can you come up with? How many do you come up with? That's a simple way to measure idea flow.
And in the book, you also have an idea ratio. How do you calculate that?
The idea ratio is meant to demonstrate the kind of volume of material needed to succeed. So we've talked about you need a lot of ideas to get a good idea. Linus Pauling once said famously, to have a good idea, you need to have a lot of ideas. But the question is, how many's a lot, Linus? He had 2 Nobel Prize awards, and he almost won a 3rd Nobel Prize. If he had discovered the double helix structure of DNA before Watson and Crick, he would have had a 3rd. What's a lot of ideas? How many do you need to get to those 3 potential Nobel Prize winning ideas? And what astounds people, the research at Stanford suggests, to get to one commercially successful outcome, you need to start with about 2,000 ideas. And that is shocking to most people. Most people think I need 20 ideas or 30 ideas to get to one that works. And the truth is it's multiple orders of magnitude more. That's what we call the idea ratio. Is you need a couple thousand ideas to get a good one. Before you do anything, stop. Come up with 2,000 ideas. That's not what we're saying. But it means over time, if you want to be routinely bringing breakthroughs to market, you need to be generating thousands of ideas as a part of your team practice in life.
How does idea flow correlate to the success of an organization?
Ideation is the fountain of youth for organizations. There's a reason that organizations tend to sunset. It's because the problems they're solving are no longer relevant, or their way that they solve the problem is no longer relevant. The Western Union, I don't even know if they're still a company, but the reason that they've declined is because we don't need to send telegrams anymore. And now payments by check cashing is going down in certain parts of the population. If you look at Blockbuster, they thought that they were a rental store. They didn't realize that they're a watching movies at home store. And if they had or a watching movies at home provider. And so they didn't do a good job of updating their solution to the problem or framing the problem. Companies that do a good job of framing the problem to be solved and in delivering and updating solutions to it, those are high idea flow organizations, and those are the organizations that persist over the long term.
You argue that creativity can be learned and turned into a daily practice. Can you double click on that?
Creativity is a capacity. It's like saying the piano can be learned. No one would argue that you can learn the piano, or no one would argue that I just can't. They may not exert effort or attention. That's their prerogative, but It's not unlearnable. Another language is not unlearnable. Creativity is the same way. It's the art of solving problems with novel solutions. That's a learnable skill just like anything else. And it's a capacity just like anything else. And the whole division of the world into creatives and non-creatives is patently absurd. And we have this problem. We see it in society. There's creative industries and non-creative industries. There's creative companies and non-creative companies. There's creative divisions and non-creative divisions, creative teams and non-creative teams, creative individuals and not. So from the highest level, the industry, all the way down to the individual, we bifurcated the world, but it's a superficial and unnecessary and false bifurcation. The truth is, everyone can be creative. And I guess ultimately it comes down to, what does it mean to be creative? My favorite definition of the word creative comes from a seventh grader in Ohio, middle of America. She said, creativity is doing more than the first thing you think of. Isn't that beautiful? Creativity is doing more than the first thing you think of. And what I love about that is that it has no reference to the arts. Often we think of creativity, we think of the arts. What the seventh grader said, is doing more than the first thing you think of. You can do that in any arena. I'm trying to write an email. What should the subject line be? If I want to be creative, do more than one subject line to an email. If I'm delivering a sales presentation and I want to be creative, what does that mean? Have more than one call to action or try them on. And then what does it mean to practice it? You talk about practice, or that it's a learnable skill. Just the pianist plays their scales. My daughters are in piano lessons. They're playing scales all the time. Swimmer swims laps. They're swimming laps regularly, right? To practice a skill or a capacity and to grow a capacity is to attend to it regularly. And very simply, the way to practice creativity is to practice doing more than the first thing you think of. We essentially call that an idea quota, where every day you articulate a problem that you know you need to solve. And instead of doing the default thing, which is think of quote unquote the right answer, which for very few of us are we facing a problem that only has one answer. We're not mathematicians. Most of us are facing problems that have 100 possible answers. An idea quota says, instead of trying to come up with the right answer, try to come up with 10 answers. Crazy answers, ordinary answers, brilliant answers, stupid answers, doesn't matter, illegal answers. Shift the goal from quality to quantity. And as you practice that muscle, you find yourself in that reflex more naturally. In the meeting, when somebody's coming up with ideas, you're less precious. Somebody asks a question, you're more willing to throw something out there because you've learned something critical, which is the following. There's no cost to saying a bad idea. None. And yet we don't do it because we're afraid. We're afraid of what people are going to say, or ourselves, what we're going to think. And so we don't grow the muscle. We don't grow the ability, but it doesn't have to be that way.
I took away the point of writing multiple subject lines in a given period of time. As mentioned in the book, it's brilliant. Why do you think hackathons are not an effective way to drive innovation?
It's not that they're not an effective way to drive innovation. It's that they're not an effective way to develop the capability. And hackathons can be, to have an intense workout or to have a race or a sprint, is another way I'd say a hackathon, is great. It can actually push people who've trained and who've exercised. A race is an exceptional thing to do from time to time among people who've trained. But if you get a bunch of people who haven't trained and who haven't stretched and who aren't strong or flexible, and you tell them to go race, you're going to have a lot of injuries. I think there's something like that with a hackathon or a sprint. People are pulling hamstrings, the proverbial hamstring, because they're sprinting and they've never stretched. They've never done any warm up or any kind of strength training. And so what we say is a judicious use of a sprint is great. A hackathon can be great. We leverage them ourselves, but don't mistake running a hackathon for innovation any more than you would mistake holding a race for building health and fitness capability. Those are very different things. And for most people in organizations, innovation equals the hackathon. And that would be tantamount to saying fitness equals the race.
How should we run effective brainstorming sessions? Because a lot of organizations do brainstorming. A lot of innovation leaders run brainstorming sessions. What are your suggestions on running effective brainstorming sessions?
We've written a full piece in Entrepreneur Magazine actually about this that really breaks down a lot. So if folks are interested, I'm sure you can provide it in the show notes. But I think one of the simplest ideas and perhaps most important is what we call an innovation sandwich, where we say, okay, when you're in a brainstorm, everything doesn't happen in that moment. So the typical approach to a brainstorm is we all get into a room and then we say what the problem is and we come up with solutions and then we make a selection and then we commission action or whatever's the next step. And what we say with the innovation sandwich is the research suggests that all those things shouldn't happen at the same time. Let's actually break them out over time. And specifically, we want to alternate between individual work and consideration and group work and consideration. So the way to do that is call it 4 parts. Part 1, send the prompt to the distribution list or the invite list in advance and give them time to consider the prompt themselves. Part 2, people arrive at a room for the purpose of sharing and building on one another's ideas, not criticizing and not deciding on the solution. And you have to do some work there to create psychological safety, et cetera, et cetera. Step 3, instead of deciding at the end, tell the group, we're going to decide when we meet next week or whenever that may be, which is going to be step 4. But in the time between now and the time we meet next, what we want to invite you to do is continue to consider the problem and consider our belief that the best ideas probably are going to occur to us collectively between now and then. We haven't thought of them yet. And if we all collectively agree that we're going to continue to marinate on and consider the problem we're trying to solve, it's highly likely that we're all going to think of better ideas between now and our next meeting. And then step 4 is, of course, coming back together and discussing not only the ideas that we generated in the first meeting, but also the ideas, the potentially better ideas that have come to us in the intervening period.
How do we identify, recruit, and retain innovative people?
Let's start with retaining, which is a very interesting kind of aspect of this. I think one of the challenges for folks who enjoy creating is not feeling like they have the space to create or that they have the permission to create. And so one of the simplest things you can do as a leader, if we talk about a leader's job is to enable work to happen, in this case, to enable creative work to happen. One of the important things you can do is you can draw the creativity out of your team and you can cultivate it, nurture it. And what that looks like, again, going back to the 7th grader's definition of creativity, what that looks like is when somebody comes to you and says, here's my idea, what's a creative leader's response? What's the response of a leader who's seeking to cultivate creativity? What else are we trying? That's great. What else are we trying? I want to see a few more. Bob McKim, who was one of the legendary creators of the design program at Stanford, famously said, anytime a student would ask for feedback, he would say, show me 3, which is a really powerful leadership technique. If you think about it, Astro Teller, who's the head of moonshots at Google's X facility, he said he always asks people for 5 solutions. Anytime they're trying to solve a problem, he asks for 5. And if you dig into it, what he'll tell you is many times a team might try to game the system and they try to bring 4 dummy ideas and 1 really good idea. And he said what he's observed is many times a team's dummy idea is every bit as good as their good idea. But forcing them to go through the process of generating alternatives actually leads to better results. And so what's one thing you can do to retain a creative team? Foreground volume, foreground options as an important part of your team's process. Now, attracting, I think, is a totally different question, which is it clear that this is the kind of place where creative work is valued? And there's all sorts of things, and that comes down to how are you positioned in the market and what are people saying about working for you and what kinds of job descriptions are you posting? There's all sorts of ways to convey creativity matters here, and we measure it and we value it and we nourish it. Attracting is more about communicating that clearly. To me, the question is, we've already talked at length about nourishing, but then retaining. If you do a good job of nourishing creativity, my observation is not only retention, but also attraction tend to take care of themselves.
And how can we use Ideaflow as a metric for our organizations, for our companies, for our startups?
What you want to do is you want to be in a routine of generating volume. For startups, especially, one of the key behaviors is crafting experiments and commissioning experiments. One of the most important things a startup founder can do is run experiments and be very clever about how they devise those experiments and how they resource them, et cetera. If you start to really be committed to experimentation as a means of learning and experimentation as a means of data creation and validation, then very quickly you start to realize, I need more ideas. I've got to have more ideas. If I'm running experiments, I need to have more ideas. As a kind of a case in point here, I would say, generally speaking, if I'm talking to an organization and I'm trying to help them assess, where do you need an intervention? What I've seen is I'll say, just answer this question. Which do you feel is a bigger need? You don't have enough ideas, so you need more ideas, or you have a ton of ideas and you need to know which ones are good ideas. I've never heard somebody say, I don't have any ideas. Everybody thinks they have tons of ideas. Everyone says, you know what we need? We need to know which of all of our tons of ideas are good ideas. So I go, great, awesome. I'm not voting. That's fine. Let's build a routine and a robust ability to experiment. You know what any organization realizes if they commit to experimentation? We don't have nearly as many ideas as we thought we did. I don't have to convince them of that. They start running experiments and they realize we need tons more ideas. So to me, robust practice of experimentation requires also rigorous ideation practice.
How do you search for better problems to solve?
One of the things that you do is you talk to customers. Sounds crazy, but you actually get in the life of your customer. You go where they are. You don't just talk in your establishment, in your store, in your restaurant, in your service center, but you go into their lives where they are. You seek to understand what are the problems they're trying to solve? What are the pain points in their life? And not only what's the friction of an experience you've created, but what's a problem they're trying to solve? That tends to be, Bob McKim, who I mentioned earlier, who often said, show me three. He also told students to keep a bug list. This is in the 1960s. It's long before computer programming entered common parlance. He's not talking about computer engineering. He's talking about keep a list of the things that bug you, the things that bother you, write them down. And if you keep a bug list, you become attuned to opportunities in a way that somebody who's not attuned to problems just doesn't.
What examples do you have of innovative companies in recent times? Are there companies which you think were innovative and probably have stopped innovation? And what are the present day innovative companies?
Obviously, you've seen people who fall from grace, GE or companies like that, storied IBM, stories, or even Kodak, for example, storied organizations, Nokia, BlackBerry. The list is actually really long of organizations that were innovative and then fell from grace. I think that we're in a huge time of upheaval and disruption. I look at what Amazon has done. It's been incredible, but they're in the middle of some woes themselves. I look at what Netflix has done, same thing. I love studying the history. I love studying the press. I love studying what organizations are doing now. There's a chapter on our book website, free for anyone to download. The website's ideaflow.design, and the chapter is called How to Think Like Bezos and Jobs. And there's 7 techniques there that Steve Jobs and Jeff Bezos routinely used to stir up their thinking and deliver breakthrough thinking. So they're a couple of heroes of mine, but I think that nobody can afford to remain complacent. No one can afford to be static or stagnant. You've got to continue. It's almost like swimming upstream. If you're not moving forward, you're moving backwards.
How is storytelling tied to Ideaflow?
It's a good question. There's a few things. One is, if you want to engender enthusiastic collaboration, you have to have a compelling narrative or a compelling story. So if you want to get people to work with you, you've got to have a story that's critical. And specifically, one of the most important aspects of story that most people neglect is, or just from the outside, you don't appreciate, there has to be rich emotion. In business, we want to be sterile and logical and reasonable and emotion free. It turns out from the brain's perspective, cognitively speaking, emotion centers are where our decisions are made. The rational brain doesn't make decisions. As my colleague Baba Shiv at Stanford likes to joke, the rational brain has been given to us to rationalize decisions we make elsewhere, which is just hilarious because we're not reasoning creatures. We are feeling creatures. And our reason tends to rationalize what we've already felt. And so if you want to enlist enthusiastic participation of collaborators or enthusiastic engagements among customers, you've got to find ways of bringing and harnessing emotion. And story is one of the best ways to do that.
What is your counterintuitive insight of teaching entrepreneurship for the last 30 years?
Counterintuitive insight. I would say from entrepreneurship, especially, I would say little data trumps big data. So many people value big data. You hear about a lot about big data and the value of large data sets, et cetera. We can be deceived, however, if we think about the number of data points as the only thing that matters. The question is the quality of the data. And to use an example, I used to be a management consultant and I often found myself running surveys in malls and things like that. And what I found is I can, by force of my personality and just even being pathetic, I can approach you in the mall food court and say, "Excuse me, mister, hate to bother you during dinner, but I just had a couple questions for you. My boss has this idea and I was wondering, do you think it's any good? Do you think this is a good idea?" So you say, "Oh, sure, buddy. Tell your boss he's got a great idea." And I put it on the clipboard. He said, "Yes." And I can do that 10,000 times. That's a big data. And I come to you as the boss and I say, "Boss, 9,900 people that I talked to said that you had a good idea." You go, "Whoa, 9,900. It's big data. It's not good data." And the question is, what's the quality of data you're creating? And with the entrepreneurs we work with, they rarely have the resources or capacity to generate large data sets. But what we're trying to get them to do is generate high quality, highly credible data sets. And the way to do that is by means of experimentation. Craft clever, scrappy experiments that yield meaningful proprietary information that the entrepreneur can use to build conviction in a particular direction.
And before we close, what is the nicest thing that anybody has done for you?
I don't know if this is nicest, but I would say I have a mentor in my life who has spent countless hours on the phone with me talking about challenges I'm facing, empathizing, caring, reaching out. There is nothing, as far as I can tell, in it for this person. And yet they are so faithful in their encouragement, in their perspective, in their wisdom, and I continue to be astounded by it.
And you'll be surprised at how many times most of the guests have a very similar answer. It's amazing that how almost everybody comes up saying that they want to thank a mentor who selflessly has actually contributed hours of their time.
Maybe just to build on that and to say a little bit more about what I shared, because I think it's useful. I wasn't always thoughtful or deliberate about cultivating mentors. I wasn't always in my life. I valued it as an idea, but if you said, "Who's mentoring you?" I'd go, "I don't know." And someone wise, a mentor of sorts, told me I should be spending on average 1 day per month. So if there's 4 weeks in a month, 2 hours a week, just break it down. Now look at my calendar. Are there 2 hours this week with a mentor or 2 mentors? And when I put it like that, I realized I am in a mentor drought. I don't ever meet with mentors. It was a real epiphany for me. This was a few years ago. I would say I haven't instrumented it precisely. I can't say that I always spend 8 hours a month with a mentor or something like that. But I would say that kind of encouragement, it's like the meta encouragement. We say Ideaflow is solving the problem of solving problems. It's like a meta skill that unlocks all these others. Insofar as mentorship is important, helping someone see how important mentorship is actually, it's like a meta skill. And so for me, that comment sent me on a quest to find and develop mentors. And nobody is going, "You know what? You want me to mentor you?" Nobody is like sitting around just like offering up mentorship. You have to, it has to come from underneath, as it were. Mentorship isn't imposed from above. It's requested from underneath. You don't have to say, "Will you be my mentor?" Because that's intimidating or pathetic. But to say, "Hey, I really value you. I'd love to spend some time chatting with you." And if that conversation goes well, I'd really love to follow up on that conversation and talk to you about things as they've unfolded. It can be natural. It doesn't have to be weird. But no one is arranging mentors for you. It's something that it's a responsibility you have to take for yourself. And so maybe you could say the nicest thing that anybody's ever done for me is inspired me to take responsibility for finding mentors for myself.
Brilliant. Jeremy, that's a great place to close this conversation. Thanks for being on the show.
It's been my pleasure. Thanks for having me.